Republican presidential frontrunner Donald Trump is rolling out his first TV ad of his campaign today. It's a 30-second spot, and it's getting a lot of attention. But before we talk about it with our next guest, here's a quick look at it.
I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message.
The politicians can pretend it's something else, but Donald Trump calls it radical Islamic terrorism. That's why he's calling for a temporary shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until we can figure out what's going on. He'll quickly cut the head off ISIS and take their oil. And he'll stop illegal immigration by building a wall on our southern border that Mexico will pay for.
We will make America great again.
All right, Trump's views are pretty well known. So what's the strategy here? And what about the ad also released today from one of his rivals, Jeb Bush? So to talk about that, we're joined right now by Clive Veroni. He's a marketing strategist and the author of Spin, How Politics Has the Power to Turn Marketing on Its Head. Clive joins us in Toronto. So, okay, let's begin with the ad. First of all, there's nothing surprising in it there in terms of his views or focus. So in your sense, what is the strategy?
Well, it's to reinforce the brand, because that ad actually is a really great expression of the Donald Trump political brand. The way it communicates is, in fact, the way he communicates, these sort of short, sharp, declarative statements, you know, ban Muslims, cut off the head of ISIS, stop illegal immigration. This is very much Donald Trump language. And the ad is a kind of reinforcement of that brand and taking that brand message now out to a much wider audience, because he's been delivering that to, you know, face to face at rallies, and now he has to reach out to a wider audience with that message. And I think the ad is good in that sense, in that it's an accurate expression of the brand Donald Trump.
So let's drill down into more specific parts of the ad. There's that one where he pledges to, quote, and then you see it written on screen, cut the head off ISIS. And the imagery there is pretty powerful, obviously deliberate. Does it have the effect, though, of turning people off as well as winning support?
Well, yes and no, because what this ad has is a lot of heat and a lot of energy. In other words, it's a very emotional piece of communication, and that, in fact, is how Donald Trump himself communicates, with a lot of heat and a lot of energy. There are a lot of assertions which are not backed up by any kind of cool logic. It's all very hot. And he simply asserts he's going to cut off the head of ISIS without actually explaining how this is even possible, even though, you know, the nations of the world have been trying to do this now for a couple of years. So it's, as I say, it's an accurate reflection of that. It's got a lot of heat and a lot of energy, and in that sense, it is meant to appeal to a certain segment of the Republican base. My concern about this ad is it enough to carry him forward to a wider audience? Because the disaffected part of the Republican base, we're not sure that that's big enough to take him to, you know, winning the nomination.
So there's one other shot in there that was interesting. It was the one that most resonated with me, and it's this black and white, almost sort of satellite footage. You can see people running toward a wall, and he's saying, I will stop Mexicans from running into the U.S. And of course, in the last hour, it's just come out that that's not, in fact, footage from the Mexican border. It's from Morocco. So, you know, I mean, we saw this happen during the Canadian election campaign, where the Conservative Party showed the wrong kind of salmon. I wonder, how does this sort of thing happen? And in his case, is it, look, the footage is polarizing, so let's use it? Or does somebody get in trouble for this?
Well, well, somebody should get in trouble for it, because that's, you know, incompetence when it comes to making an ad. Now, political ads are made on the fly. They're usually turned around very quickly, but they've had a long time to work on this ad. They've had a long time to check the footage. People know that these ads sometimes have problems, so there's actually no excuse for that kind of error to happen. Who knows if heads will roll, but they definitely should, because that's a big mistake.
All right, so there's another ad out today from Jeb Bush, who a lot of people thought was going to be the front runner and has struggled to get any kind of traction. Let's very quickly show what he's putting out there today.
Serious times require serious leadership. The last 7 years under President Obama have taught us that problems do not take care of themselves in the absence of American leadership. The United States should not delay in leading a global coalition to take out ISIS with overwhelming force. We are at war with radical Islamic terrorism. We have but one choice: to defeat it. I'm Jeb Bush, and I approve this message.
Okay, so for the guy who was considered to be the more temperate of the group, that seems like a fairly inflammatory ad.
It is. And what that ad says to me is that Donald Trump has successfully set the agenda for the debate when it comes to election ads in this campaign. Is he's set the subject and the tone of the ads, and others are now following. Not just Jeb Bush, but Marco Rubio, for example, has a similar kind of ad that appeals to people's fears. The problem with this ad, and what contrasts it with the Trump ad, is I said the Trump ad was an accurate reflection of his brand. And this is the opposite, because people see that ad and they have a pre-existing perception of Bush as kind of a more, low energy, as Trump has described him, not as much heat coming from him and not as much energy. So people seeing this ad would actually have a disconnection between their existing perceptions and what the ad is telling them. You know, there's nothing worse than an ad that promises more than the product delivers, because that actually disappoints the voter in the end. And I think that's the problem that's happening with this ad. What Bush needs to do is find his own voice and his own subject matter in this debate. And unless he does so, I think he's going to continue to flounder in this campaign.
Trump in particular has said, look, I'm leading, in the language that only he can come up with, and said, I don't even need to spend ads. I'm not entirely sure where I'm doing this. I'm already a front runner. But in this day and age, does he have to? Is it just part of the way you run a race?
Well, he absolutely does have to. And you have to separate out the narrative, the leadership narrative, which is his relative position to the other candidates, versus his absolute position, which is how much support does he have amongst the general population. You may recall that back in the Canadian election, the NDP, the narrative about the NDP early on in the race was they were the leaders, and that was the narrative. But people were ignoring the actual numbers for the NDP, which were relatively weak. Bush has in the latest poll Trump has in the latest poll something around 39% of support amongst registered Republican voters. That's a big number, but registered Republican voters they're less than a quarter of the population, 24%. So 39% of 24%, he's still only around 10% of the general population. His absolute position is not that strong, even though the narrative is that he's in the lead.
Really important context. Thanks so much for joining us, Clive.
You're welcome.
Marketing specialist and author Clive Veroni, who's in Toronto.